I'm Alex Case-Cohen. I manage the Pend Oreille Conservation District located in Newport, Washington. That's where our office is located. But our district encompasses all of Pend Oreille County, excluding the towns of Cusick and Medellin Falls. But we do hope to incorporate those towns soon into our district so we can provide services. But everyone else, if you live in Newport, if you live in Medellin, Ione, or elsewhere, then we can certainly help to offer services to you guys. So I'm also here with Gregg DePonte of Ola Aina Farms out of Colville. And we also have Schachtschneider, who's with Lightning S Livestock Solutions out of Pendleton. And I'm sorry, what? Sure, maybe. We have talked about that today, but not quite. So I will pass the mic off to them to cover more of this topic. But today we're speaking with you all about implementing regenerative agriculture for weed mitigation and soil health improvement. So if you guys have a conversation, please feel free to go outside. I have a pretty quiet voice, so thank you.
Hey, you in the back, go outside, please. Can't hear. Listen down. I know.
Thank you. Thanks so much. Thank you, guys. Okay. Yeah. Let's get this over here. Okay. So I'm going to ask you guys, I last night sort of had an epiphany, and it's something that I want to try out in my presentations and something that I've attempted or implemented when I'm talking about stream bank stabilization, is I want us to envision what we think this area looked like before our families got here, when it was the tribe and other entities managing this land for natural resources, when there were ample deer and elk and ungulates, when there were predators, which we won't necessarily talk about right now. Waterfowl came as they pleased and left as they needed to for migration. The big thing that I want you guys to think about is the role that biodiversity really played in this land and in this landscape. Now, in my work, when I'm working with landowners, say in a converted wetland that's now a hayfield, or it's been planted into hay, been used for grazing repeatedly, it's hard for me to envision what those areas looked like at this time. I ask experts, I look at records, and it's really hard to say what plants they are or what plants were used. When we look in our forested areas, we have a much better idea because those have been left as they were or managed as they were historically. Now, there are some caveats, right? Fire was way more prevalent back then, and we're talking low-grade fires that would burn up the underbrush. So all that ocean spray, all the Oregon grape maybe wasn't in as great of quantity back then. We certainly didn't have the weeds that we're all here learning about today. But in large part, I would say, because one, there weren't a lot of fences to prevent ungulates from moving from one piece of property to another. They developed patterns over generations that were passed down to their young to move to different spots at different times of the year, to graze in hundreds or thousands per herd at different times, right? So we don't have that anymore. In addition, we've planted monocrops of plants that we want to see because they are profitable and have been beneficial to us as commodities, and that's certainly understandable. You know, I've had some conversations with hay growers and Hay Growers Association, and we can maybe talk about this at another point. But a lot of the hay that's grown in this region, either it's for export, which it's a lot harder to incorporate more diversity into that because the export markets are really looking for that monocrop. They need a lot more structure and an understanding of what the product is that they're getting. But if we're selling hay to, say, horse folks, you know, maybe increasing that education, incorporating diversity, adding more different species to our monocrops to make stronger and healthier soils, and to make a better plant that's actually healthier for the horses and for the livestock that we're feeding. So I just want you guys to think about these things, you know, as you're managing your property, as you're working with your neighbors, envision what it would be like if those those fences weren't there, or if there were more practices that were used like what were used historically. And one thing I would like to see would be some of those practices to be returned in a way. Again, I don't know what that looks like yet, and it's something that I'm really working with, and I'm working with local experts and people who have been in this county for multiple generations and for decades. And yeah, so that's kind of the vision that we're going to and we're going for. It's a gorgeous area. I'm so grateful to be here, and I'm so grateful to know many of you in this room already. Yeah, so really that's kind of the starting point. We're hoping to increase that biodiversity, to manage our weeds with a multitude of ways. You know, herbicides can be useful in some degree in some areas, but exploring things like prescribed burning where it may be appropriate, or increasing your tillage as a method for weeds mitigation, occasionally to maybe conquer that initial disturbance, to break that cycle that those weeds have established. One thing we'll really get into with these guys is the role of regenerative rotational grazing. So using livestock, working with your neighbors. We're not saying that everyone who comes out today has to go buy a flock of sheep or bunch of cows, because I know some of us may not want to do that, but there are people in this room who have livestock and they need land to graze that livestock. So why not use your neighbors and resources that are available to do so? So now I'm going to pass it off to Chris.
Thanks, Alex. Can you guys hear me? Perfect. Okay, so we're gonna kind of jump through this, and one of the things that I really like is I know presentations you've seen a lot today, and you kind of get that death by PowerPoint glaze, especially towards the end of the day. So I'm going to try to hustle through a lot of this stuff so that we can talk about things after the fact. I am also one of those that would prefer discussion versus just staring at a screen and listening to me talk. So if you have questions, raise your hand. We will stop and talk about them at that point in time. So my name is Gregg Schachtschneider. Recently started a consulting company, Lightning S Livestock Solutions. Mostly what I'm focusing on is incorporating livestock as a tool for landscape management. So I'm not necessarily trying to say that we need livestock everywhere. I'm saying, how does it fit your personal and ecological needs? And then what can we do to do that? But as we're looking at some of these things, let's see if this will jump. There we go. When we really look at the crux of the system, it all boils down to good old Paul Harvey's quote right here, that our entire existence is the sheer fact that we have 6 inches of topsoil. That's give or take, depending on where you're at, and the fact that it rains. Without that, am I close enough so that they can hear? Okay, I'm a fidgeter, so I move. So standing in front of a screen and asking them that is, so yes, this is really the crux of our existence in this entire thing. So that topsoil is a very important piece to us, and we want to make sure that we keep it all the time, because when it rains around here and things get soupy and nasty, where do things travel? Downhill. How many times have you seen muddy creeks or muddy rivers? Because soil is moving downhill. To me, I know I'm not going to be able to eliminate that completely, especially when you get into those 100 and 1,000-year rain events, but I want to try to minimize that as much as possible, especially for you guys, because the one that really caught my eye a little while ago was, here's a quick question for everybody. 1 ton of topsoil across an acre, how thick is that?
Quarter of an inch. 1 inch.
About the thickness of a sheet of paper. So when you spread that over the course of an acre, about the thickness of a sheet of paper is 1 ton of topsoil. So when it rains and you see muddy rivers, how many tons of topsoil are potentially in that water? When you see a dust storm and the wind blows, this may not be as pertinent for you guys, but definitely down in my country on I-84 from Pendleton to Hermiston, there are literally signs, dust hazards. And I'm sitting there thinking, scratching my head going, okay, well, this farmer is giving this farmer a couple of tons, and then This farmer's giving that guy a couple of tons. Where does it end? You know, I don't wanna lose it. I'd much rather be the person that has stable soil so that when the neighbor's topsoil blows to me, I capture and keep it. You know, I mean, maybe I'm greedy that way, but that's kind of what I think about. And so that topsoil is really healthy. And so when we look at some of the complexities that we have in life, we've done some things that have caused some serious difficulties with keeping and holding topsoil. How do we do that? And how do we maintain our topsoil? And how do we keep thriving plants and keep a viable operation going? In the Midwest, they talk about the possibility from the Dust Bowl on of losing upwards of 8 feet of topsoil in some locations. And so think of the fertility that just went off the farm as we start doing these things. And so when I'm looking at this, the two biggest things that I'm looking at when we're talking about practices and working on building topsoil and building life in our system is, are we building or are we extracting? And so if we're extracting, then that generally leads to lower soil health and higher erosion issues, and everything tends to just lose in that entire system. But when we look at this, it's not that simple all the time. And so we're looking at a three-pronged approach here in everything that I do, and that is an economical approach. So we have to make money in order to keep in the business. Ecological approach. So we have to continue to build life and build soil, or we lose business, because once we lose the functionality of the system, then generally we lose the economics. But then we also have the social aspect. And so I've been around the counties. So we've been in Perry Stevens and Pend Oreille County this week talking to different people about a project that we'll dive into a little bit further. And one of the things that's kind of been on everybody's mind is it's tax season. And so I've heard a couple of people, they're like, we did great this year. We only lost $5,000. And so, but then I asked them, like, how much, you know, like, what was your time valued? And they're like, oh, well, we didn't count that because that's just our time. That's a social piece. You know, we have been ingrained as farmers that we're supposed to work our asses off and then hope that we make money at the end of the year. You know, and so as we're building things, I want to also build the social structure so that taking a vacation doesn't seem like an odd and novel thing to do. You know, I think most of you have heard the conversation or the joke that they did a survey with 50 farmers and they asked them what they did in their spare time. And out of the 50 farmers, 40 of them didn't understand the question. 5 of them couldn't understand when there was spare time. And then 5 of them just started muttering and going back to work. You know, and that's kind of our system. You know, the livestock side, that's a lot of our ranchers too. You know, we just know how to work, put our heads down and get to work. But we want to build some of these things because a 3-legged stool, if you lose one of those pieces, it cannot stand. And when we talk about that social aspect, another one of those big pieces is successional transitions. You know, we have an aging farming and ranching community right now because young people aren't either wanting or able to get in, and therefore the elderly generations can't get out. And so that's a big social construct that we need to work on developing. And so we're going to go through some of these really quick. So the ecological leg, there's some pretty simple but complicated things to do. So when we look at the ecological leg, we're going to follow some key principles when we're trying to focus on this. So number one, context. I'm not going to, I'll get just a second. I'm not going to talk about this country the same as I would if I went down to Burns, Oregon. It's sagebrush flat, high desert down there. It's not the same context. So I'm not going to talk about the same grazing plans or the same cover crop seedings down there as I would up here. Totally different context. So what was your question? Oh, you didn't have one? Oh, I thought you raised your hand. Sorry. I was excited for a second. So we have to know our context. So we know that we have, from what I've understood from around here, we have ranges from fairly rocky sandy soils to high clay soils. So there could be within a 10-mile stretch, there could be a totally different context between two properties. So those are all the things that we need to worry about and focus on when we're looking at this. Number two, disturbance. We need to try to minimize their disturbance as much as possible, because we know that those things are issues that can affect that biology. So one of the things that I talk about is if you look at any of the labels of all of the different pesticides, there are various biology and beneficial microbiology that those can affect. And so if we're using 5 different pesticides on one pasture, there's a good chance that there's a lot of beneficials that have also been annihilated throughout that process. Classic example, if you look at glyphosate, one of its secondary labels is an antibacterial. And so if we want a good microbiology in our soil, heavy use of some of these chemicals is going to naturally negate some of those to be counterintuitive. But we also have to manage things for the way that we deem in our ecological, our economic, and our social aspects. So in everything that I do, chemical use is not off the table, but we want to be very judicial in its use. So we want to look at what are we actually doing? Is it going to meet the intended application of what we want it to do? And what are those unintended consequences that we may not necessarily think about all the time? And so I want to start getting people to think a little bit about more, what's the other things that this is going to affect that I may not be aware of. Cover and build armor. So if we have standing and growing crops on the soil at all times, how effective is it going to be to wash away when the wind and the rain comes? It's going to be very difficult. But if we have bare ground and we get a good rain, naturally you watch that stuff just flow pretty quick. So we want to try to cover that soil as much as possible. And there's some really cool information out there on how just cover of the soil can be very beneficial in germination rates and then reduction in our erosion due wind and whatever you want. Mixing it up. So this is one that we've had a lot of fun talking about. And this is something that's really difficult to do because most often we like something that is very static, and our brains just like something that's consistent all the time. But when we mix it up, sometimes that throws that whole plan out the window. And so that could be mixing it up with various crops, could be incorporating cover crop systems, could be varying livestock. And then when we add livestock, we can add a whole nother layer in there because you can have different species of livestock that you use. You can have different age classes that you use. And then you have different intensities and times. And so you could graze it really heavy for a really short time or graze it fairly moderate for a little bit longer time. So there's a lot of different variables out there that you can do to mix it up. And the best way that I've described it to people is if I come up here and I go up to Alex's office and I say, hey, Alex, we're going to go for a drive and go do something. And every time that I do that with her, we go do something different. Pretty soon, she's going to have a suitcase right there at her door. Like when Chris comes, I am ready. And so she's going to have her snowshoes. She's going to have her swimsuit and her surfboard. She's going to have it all because she doesn't know what to expect. And what's really fun about that is you're kind of laughing about that and you can totally see, I'm sure you have some people in your life that when they come, you're like, oh crap, what are we going to do now? But our biology and our soils are very similar in that way, is that if we throw the book at them and change things all the time, then that forces it to be more adaptable. And so then it becomes more resilient because now it's able to manage all of these different pressures that we put on it in that process. Living roots. So this is another one. If we are, when we talk about the fact that we have soil and it rains, the other piece that we don't necessarily discuss in that Paul Harvey quote is solar capturing. So as long as the sun is out, there is a possibility that we can capture energy from it to grow something. If we don't have a living root in the soil, we are not growing anything. And so the more often and the longer that we can have living roots in the soil, the more chances we can gain value in the biology as well as on the economic side of things. And then livestock. I just like livestock, so it's always good to make sure that they're in there too. But, and the reality of it is there's very few places, mostly when you get into the rainforest country, where ungulates were not part of the equation originally. So we talked about how Alex said, we had thousands of elk, deer, potentially some bison could get up this far, probably not very often, but then you have sheep, goats. I mean, all of that wildlife that used to be here was incorporated in using these lands. And that's only the main mammals. Then you got the ducks and everything else that, like Alex was talking about, not to mention beneficial insects and different things that we're doing it that way. So there's a lot of different life that used to utilize this landscape. And so when we're trying to do things, we're not going to be able to, to get bolstered quite to that level. But the more that we incorporate in that, the more resilient that piece is going to be, the better the biology is going to be, and then also the more opportunities for profitability. And so when we start differentiating with those systems, now we can use livestock to terminate a cover crop or to go eat weeds, because that's kind of what we're talking about here. And that instead of having to apply pesticides, which has a cost, we could potentially hire livestock, which could appreciate in value and bring money generation into the system. So that was a little bit longer than I wanted to be, but we'll go through this one quick. So energy flow, we already talked about capture and sunlight. Water cycle, when it rains, there's a difference between how much water we get and how much water we can capture, hold, and use. And so I really like Nicole Masters has a book for the love of soil, and she has a producer that she works with down in Australia. And my favorite is every time that they do something, people will ask him, how much water do you get? And his answer is all of it. And he emphasizes that he will never tell them a total inches. And I'd be willing to bet that it may not even be an inch sometimes, where he's at. But his focus is, it doesn't matter how much water I get. It's a matter of how much water I can capture, hold, and utilize. So if I'm in Indiana and I have bare soil, and I get a rain event that drops 5 inches of rain, and you watch just sheets of water and soil flying off that field, how much water did I actually get to utilize in that rain event? Whereas if I have that same thing, but I have, potentially even residue, maybe not even a living root, but if I have a living root, it's even better. And then I go to a place like Gabe Brown in Bismarck, North Dakota, where he has a water infiltration rate of over 18 inches an hour. If he gets a 5-inch rain event in a matter of 6 hours, every single inch goes in there. If he gets a 5-inch rain event in 30 minutes, every inch can go down into the soil. And so how we utilize that water and how we capture and hold, I know it is insane. And I've seen a video where they do the 4-inch water ring where you're looking at water infiltration rate. They put the equivalent of 2 inches of water in that ring, and it almost looks like someone pulled a stopper on a kitchen sink. It just, except for the swirls, it just straight down into the water or straight down into the ground. It's cool. And it's awesome when we can do that. But a lot of that has to do with the biology that we're building and everything else that we do. So the mineral cycle. A lot of times when we're looking at growing plants, the main focus is NPK. And we look at inorganic sources, which is the way that a plant can directly pull it from the ground. But all of those organic sources and everything else that's in there, when we have functional biology, it's amazing on what things can do. There's a guy, Rick Clark in Indiana ground, that he'll plant cereal rye, which may be a taboo conversation depending on who you are in this country. But he'll plant cereal rye, and when he does sampling on it, when he terminates it right before full maturity, before he plants a soybean or a corn crop in there, he has over 300 pounds of nitrogen in that crop, and he hasn't fertilized in 15 years. So he has the biology in the system that is capturing that nitrogen, that's capturing phosphorus, capturing potassium, and everything else because he has a functional biology within that system. And then again, diversity, because we mix it up, we create better things. So then when we look at this, kind of the adaptive steward, so compounding. So are we building things together and compounding our efforts when we do stuff? Are we creating disruption? And so that disruption is more of that mixing it up, not necessarily disturbing the soil, but changing things where that plant and that and that community has to be resilient for it. And then again, diversity. And so when you look at this, what do we have in common in all three of these? Diversity, diversity, and mixing it up, diversity. And so the more diverse that we have a system, the better off we're going to be within it. And when you look at our country, or when you look at in North America, this is just a fraction of what we used to see out there. So there's plenty of diversity. And I don't even have insects in there. Well, I have one because I love dung beetles. They're awesome. But when we look at our diversity in our farming and ranching systems, a lot of times it's almost non-existent. And that's a paradigm shift that we have within our system, because we want clean, immaculate fields, you know, and that's a social construct. That's something that we always think about. It has to be perfect, you know. And when we talked about, you know, Alex talked about horse hay, and I own some horses and I deal with some horse people. And yeah, sometimes I want to rip my hair out and scream about them too, because they are so particular about it being exactly right. But what's really funny about that is my 3 horses, I have a alfalfa grass hay mix in I do 3x4 bales and put a net on it. I have a barley hay bale that I have out there. And still my horses were eating the seed heads off of Canada thistle. Like, they've got plenty of good forage right there in front of them, and they're going out there picking seed heads off Canada thistle. They go out there and they're grading and mulling. They're doing, I mean, it's amazing on what they'll do if they have those little bit of pieces. You know, one of my mares is always in the summer, if you're not careful, always has teasel through her mane, because she's diving in, catching those bud stages underneath the stalks from last year. And I want to rip my hair out because you just about have to shave her mane. But she's going after diversity. She's got plenty of good feed. Like, it's not like she's starving to death, but she still wants that diversity, and there's something that they need in it. So when we start looking at cover crop within our cropping systems, this is one way that we can add diversity. And so when we look at kind of the context of our meeting today, how does ecology, or how does the ecosystem try to add diversity to our monoculture systems? With weed.
Over here.
Yep. It's trying to tell us that we need some diversity in there, and here we'll help you. And then we say, gee, thanks. Really appreciate it. You know, and so that's kind of that ecology telling us, hey, we need something here. And one of the things that we talk about, actually, I'll get to that in a second. But when we do this, we need to find that balance. So how can we add that diversity, but still maintain some of those cash crops that we are doing, and still maintain some of those social paradigms? So, you know, how can you have horse hay for these very particular people and still maintain diversity? I don't know, unless we have a complete paradigm shift in the way that we educate those people. And one that I would love to do is take some of these really diverse cover crop mixes that I've been working with and bale that into small bales and give them one of those cover crop mix bales and like the highest quality alfalfa bale you could ever find, and say, give your horse a flake of each and see what they eat first. And the terrifying thing is, I've had people do this in the cow side of stuff, and they say that it's a fight over the cover crop bale, then a fight over the alfalfa, and then a fight over anything else that they put out there. And it's time and time again, every single year, his cows prefer the cover crop bale versus anything else, because that diversity allows them to better match the diet that they have. And so how many of you have ever had food cravings before? Not this sugar, not this sugar. Yeah, yeah. Yeah, me too. Sauerkraut, okay. So there's a lot of biology in sauerkraut. And there's a lot of beneficial bacteria. Some of that stuff's already broken down, so there's high nutrients in there. And so your body's telling you, hey, there's something in here, and there could be some salt, you know, that I need this. And so we're not quite as attuned to that need as a lot of our livestock and our wildlife are, but animals have an innate ability to balance their nutritional needs through their diet. And so my major professor at University of Idaho at one point in time told me that, you know, cows may not have a very big brain, but it is highly specialized in putting food in their mouth and just staying comfortable the rest of their life. And so they have the ability to understand that they can balance their diets to negate toxins. A classic example that we find in sheep and goats is bitter brush helps the sage go down. So sagebrush has a lot of terpenes. Bitter brush has a lot of tannins. If they're eaten individually, both of them can't be eaten very much because they'll make the animal sick because of those compounds. But when bitter brush is eaten and then sagebrush is eaten, the tannins bind the terpenes and then they can eat more of both. And livestock have figured this out. Like they've been doing it for several hundred years before we even realized that that was even possible. So there's an innate ability and a possibility they can do that. So when we look at economics, how does it pencil out? So I already talked about Rick Clark. In his process of doing some of these things, he has, for the last 15 years, has not applied any chemicals on his place. No fertilizers or pesticides. He figures he's saving himself about $2 million a year on 5,600 acres. How many of you would like to save $2 million a year on chemicals alone? And then still, the other piece that he talked about, he reduces horsepower in his tractors because he didn't need bigger ones. He sold his sprayer because he didn't need it anymore. You know, he's done a lot of these things and done some really cool stuff. Gabe Brown, I talked a little bit about him. He does a whole bunch of things that he does. His cattle, a couple of years ago, 750 head of mother cows, plus all of those calves for 2 years to finish them out for feeding out, and he sells beef rather than cattle. So there's roughly almost 2,100+ head of cattle on his operation at any one point in time. That entire herd of 2,100 head went through less than 1 ton of salt and trace mineral in 1 year. And so they finally eliminated it a couple years ago. And so because he's building biology, those animals are even getting their trace mineral needs through the forage now. And he just, you know, at that point in time, he's like, well, if you need it, then we don't want you on the place anymore. And so they're starting to select more for that. The other thing that he's doing is he's consistently 3 to 4 times higher profit per acre, not necessarily production per acre, but profit per acre than his neighbors. And so that's one of those paradigm shifts that we have too, is when we're focused on profit, there's a lot of inputs that get driven into us for that. And so weeds can reduce production. So we need to get rid of those weeds. But when we're looking at profit per acre, maybe some weed thresholds are okay, especially if we're incorporating livestock in there, because there's very few weeds that livestock won't eat for us. The other thing that's really cool about this is his cattle, because of what he's doing, now have a omega-3 or omega-6 to omega-3 fatty acid ratio that's almost equivalent, or that's slightly better than wild-caught salmon. And so when people talk about how salmon's a really good heart-healthy thing, you know, and that we need to have it at least once a week to balance that, his beef matches it. And so he could literally, he hasn't done it yet, but he could literally market his beef as heart-healthy beef, according to the American Heart Association. And that's because of the grazing and different things that he does. Yes. All of it is on that 6,000 acres. All of it is grazed on cover crops, finished on cover crops, and processed. He does send them off to get processed, but they are finished on his place. And his calves on his cover crops can gain 3.5 to 4 pounds a day. And the biggest feedlot in Oregon that's right next to me in Boardman averages 3.5 pounds a day on their 62,000 head of cattle. So his cover crop cattle are gaining just as well as if you threw them at a feedlot. So he's not labeled organic, which is kind of funny because he hasn't sprayed in over 15 years. And so he very well could meet most of the requirements organic. But when I was there in August, we had someone ask him that, you know, since you're already there, why don't you label yourself organic? And his exact term was, I don't want to stoop to their level. He's like, I'm way above organic because most of the organic has substituted synthetics with organic chemicals and rely on heavy tillage in order to mitigate weeds. And he's doing neither one of those. He's focusing on building biology and has done an amazing job doing it. And so I kind of have to laugh at that one, but yeah.
What's the, for some examples, of cover crops?
So cover crops are going to be a lot of different things. Normally in some of his mixes, you're going to see like some triticale. So triticale for a little bit of grass forage. He likes sorghum Sudan grass and varieties of that for some of those summer annuals. Sunflowers is another one, and that's a summer one. Clovers would be one that could be used up here. And so there's going to be a lot of different varieties of stuff. Phacelia is another one that they like. Chicory is one that they use quite a bit of. Vetch is one that a lot of people use, but I've heard that may be another taboo one to have a conversation about here. And so there's a lot of different varieties and different things that you can do, and they're all going to be fairly site specific too. So like you're saying, in that high clay soil, we're going to have a different type of variety versus a sandy soil that you're more up on the mountain. The biggest thing is you're looking at different or that variety. So we want different variety in the classes of crop that we have, or of species that we have. So you need some grasses, some legumes, maybe some and some forbs in there, and the balance in which you do that. And so I don't necessarily want to throw specifics out because we haven't gone through that yet. Yeah.
So you mentioned earlier that cattle or livestock can be used to help clear noxious weed. Are they better at clearing some more than others?
Yes. So for the people in the audience, which I just forgot that I haven't done that, the question that she asked is, are cattle or are livestock better at clearing some weeds versus others? And that is an absolute yes, and it's going to be dependent on the species.
It's also the training as well.
And the training, yeah, there's that too. So when you look at that, if you have kind of I don't have a whiteboard anywhere, but sorry for the people in the audience or for people online, but if you have like a triangle right here, you're going to have three main classes of plant species. You're going to have your grasses, your forbs, and your shrubs. And so when you look at that, various species are going to be different. So if we have grasses over here, or forbs over here and shrubs over here, sheep are almost dead center in that triangle. They are a very good equal user of virtually everything. And that's going to be dependent on the time of year. So they're going to be a little heavier on grasses in the spring, and they're going to be heavier on shrubs at the end of the year during the winter months. But throughout the entire year, if given the opportunity, they're going to nibble on just about everything out there.
That's what we need back with these hills to help prevent these forest fires.
Yeah.
We need to run bands of sheep in here.
Bands of sheep
or cattle to keep the foliage down.
There's a lot of possibilities there. Or if you have goats, goats are going to shy away from the grasses and be more heavy on the forbs and the shrubs. So I kind of cringe and cry a little bit when I go through and see a beautiful orchard grass pasture with goats in it. I'm like, that is a really cool pasture to throw horses in, but them goats are mad at you because that's not what they want. They are a forb and a shrub selector. Horses are going to shy more on the grasses, but they still eat a little bit of everything. And so depending on the species is going to kind of depend on what you're looking at. And then there's toxicities in there. So yellow star thistle, don't let your horses eat it because it's highly toxic to horses. The goats, the sheep, the cattle, because they're ruminants, can process that a lot easier. So there's going to be some varieties and different things there. Leafy spurge or any of the other spurges, sheep and goats do fantastic on. And they actually gain weight. Like, it is highly nutritious for those animals. And Greg, you're welcome to chime in if you want.
Yeah.
I'll do that.
You want to talk about that?
When you go that side.
Okay, yeah, so I guess we'll talk about that in a second. So another one that we look at, how many of you understand bricks and kind of what that looks as? Have you heard of that concept before? Because we could spend an entire day on that one. So the bricks level in a plant is essentially how much free solubles are in the sap and in the plant tissue of that plant. The higher the bricks level, basically, the better and healthier that plant is. And so I got this slide from Dr. Dystra. There we go. An entomologist from Florida that basically has demonstrated that the higher the Brix on a plant, the less likely you're going to see insects, the less likely you're going to see disease, and also we're seeing the less likely that you're going to see weed presence in that system. And so one that I really like when people are having weed troubles is a refractometer is about 25 bucks at Amazon, so it's really cheap. And then you buy a garlic press. And so if you have weeds and you have your target plant, what you do is you grab a little bit of those weeds, stuff it in that garlic press, kind of bounce on a little bit to get the juices out, stick it on the refractometer, read that number, clean it off, go over to your other plants and do the same thing and read it. More often than not, if you're seeing weeds increasing in presence, the weeds will have a higher Brix than your target species. And so this is gonna kind of sound mean, but whatever you're doing a great job farming for that weed at that point in time. Because it's showing you, and you can read it right there. You know, if their Brix is higher, then it is doing healthier with whatever management practice you have at that moment in time. And so that's a really good one to kind of read yourself. So if the Brix is lower on the weeds than your plants, then that means that your target plant is probably taking over in that community compared to the weeds taking over on its own. And so it can be a very humbling experience to have a refractometer and go around and look at these things. The other one that's really interesting about that is Dr. Dijkstra talked about how all of the GMO varieties that he has tested, he has never been able to see one without significant inputs get above 7. And I don't know what or why, but GMO crops just have a hard time getting out of that 7 range. And so essentially kind of the Brix level, what you're looking at is this 3 to 7 range is when a plant can grow the structure or the foundation and building blocks of a plant. So it'll have a stem, it'll have a seed, it'll do all that, but it can't populate the rooms. Like if it was a building, it can't populate the rooms very well. As you get into the 8 and 11, that's when you start seeing higher secondary metabolites. And those secondary metabolites are connected to its reproductive system, connected to its defenses systems. So, but then also, as you create secondary metabolites, those become more complex structures within that plant. And so you notice aphids. Aphids have a very simple digestive system. So as soon as you start creating complexity in that plant, the aphids phase out because they can't eat it. And then the same as you go, except for grasshoppers. Grasshoppers are the tricky one. They're kind of nasty little buggers because they can create more or they can do more. But even them, as you get into that really high Brix level, they even fade out of that system. So like I said, we could spend a day on Brix and the cool things about that. So we did talk a little bit about this. This was kind of back there. But so livestock can do really well when we incorporate cover crops into a system. But then the social side of things, how do we manage all this? So like Alex talked about, we don't want to tell everybody in here that you need to start buying livestock, because livestock you have to manage 365 days a year. But what we can do is we can work with producers around us that do have livestock and create some synergies within that system on that social side to help build stuff. There's a lot of equipment and there's all that. And especially like you see this picture, that guy's calving in the middle of January. How many people want to be out there dealing with cattle when there's 3 feet of snow on the ground?
How about March?
How about March? Yeah. Or calving in March when you have snow on the ground, you know? And then also this last one, how many of you need one more thing to do in your life? I didn't see any hands raised. Like, sure. Oh, you got one? Well, kind of. He's quick. Like, yeah, maybe not. So when we balance this is where we talk about this. And what I really like about this is rising tides raise all ships. And so as we work on helping each other be better, then everybody's going to improve and get better. In our conversations about our projects, one group of 4 up in Northport that we're talking, they're like, you know, one thing that could work is if each one of us tried something different each year, we'd get 4 trials a year that we could all talk about. And so now we're quadrupling our learning curve just by having conversations and planning together on what we should try and how we should do things. And I was like, fantastic, keep going.
Is that you there? And Shep's on there? Is
That's my daughter.
that right?
I'm the one right here.
I was gonna ask you if you've done some of that.
Yeah, I love that. But yeah, that's my daughter, and she loves the brand.
Those four people getting together, does that reinforce the social way on the stool?
Exactly, yeah. So the question for the virtual audience was, does that people working together enforce that social leg of that stool? And you're absolutely correct, because as we start working together, we're building that community. The other thing that's really cool about that is as we build this community and we get better at the ecological and the economical, now we can start working at developing our communities too. And, you know, one of the things that I heard on a podcast, and there's various levels of interpretation, but they were talking about a place back in the Midwest that arguably the county that this guy was from is the most productive farm county in the United States. How you measure that, I'm not even going to get in the weeds, but needless to say, they produce a lot of produce, or they produce a lot of crops there. The grocery stores in that county import 98%. So they're growing a ton of feed that's not going to feed their community. And so that's some of the things that we're looking at. 2020 really emphasized the concerns that our consumers have about where their food comes from and whether or not it'll be at the grocery store. And this is a really good time frame with some of the other things that we have going that are going to build in feeding our local communities and trying to keep some of this stuff local before we branch out and move forward. And that's only going to help that social leg as well as build everybody else up too. Because now when you're making money, you're spending it back in that community to raise that whole community. And we're building rather than extracting, like we talked about in one of those first slides. Because a lot of our bigger corporations, they're extracting that money to a central location. We're trying to build community and keep that here locally. So understanding weed pressure. So this is one that we're looking at. Another piece that we didn't talk about is that weeds provide a service. There's a reason that they're there. And there's a reason that weeds will pop up one year and kind of disappear next year. And it's because of some of the ecological functions within that system. One of the easy ones that I like to talk about is Canada thistle. So it's this simple yet that complicated. Canada thistle likes waterlogged compacted soils. So if we can identify ways to aerate soil that we're worried about with, or aerate soils that we have concerns about Canada thistle, it tends to just disappear. So as soon as we aerate that soil, it'll disappear. But what is Canada thistle doing while it's there? It's got a really giant, nasty taproot that can break through compaction layers. It can start opening up ground that allows water to infiltrate, that allows air to start coming in. And so that again, that ecology, Mother Nature is trying to tell us, we need this plant to help us do this job. And then we go, well, no, thanks, we're just going to chop it off. And then it comes back next year because it's like, we still have this problem, we need this plant. And so as we learn to do that, we can modify that. So now if we see Canada thistle, we can do something like daikon radish. Because daikon radishes, the big old root that goes boom, straight down in that ground and can mash those compaction layers. But that cattle absolutely love. And you'll watch them digging in the dirt to actually eat that root from that daikon radish. And so as we understand what the needs are of our ecology based on the weeds that we're seeing, we can generally find or identify mechanical ways or find other species that are a lot more favorable to what we want to achieve that same goal. And it could also be something as much as maybe we need to pull our cattle off of this location because they can't. You know, I'm sure you've seen like the rings around trees in the summer, you know, and then all of a sudden weeds pop up in that spot. So that's the ecology saying, okay, your cattle overuse this, now we need to fix it again. And so When Weeds Talk is a great book that you can find at Acres USA that helps identify this. It's not a be all end all. It doesn't have every answer. And some answers are not that easy. So when you're talking about swamplands and Canada thistle, if that ground's underwater for 6 months out of the year, it's gonna be really difficult to aerate it just because of the natural system there. So it's not necessarily gonna be an easy fix all the time, but the more that we focus on building biology, typically the less we have to worry about those weeds.
We are coming up on time, but I'm
Okay.
gonna give you guys, hopefully everything's okay with you guys.
It will only be 2 minutes.
We're wrapping up, but
We've got 2 slides and that's pretty much it. So primarily I'm a sheep raiser. And we're here talking about weeds, right? What's the fastest way to get rid of a weed? To get the fastest way to stop calling it a weed, right? Yeah, automatically you're done. In my instance as a grazer, and this is my perspective, this is my context. Grazing weeds is forage, that's food, and sheep are the best animal for the diversity of weeds that we face, like Chris had mentioned with that triangle. In this picture that you're seeing right here, my sheep are eating tumble mustard and Oreolissum, 2 really bad weeds that we don't like to have around here. And that's what they're capable of doing, but we have to train them. These are young lambs that they're with their mothers, and the mother imparts that behavior on them. Once I've trained the mothers to do it, they do the training for me. So this slide here is just showing what the feed value of a lot of the weeds that we have actually are. When you start seeing those numbers, they look pretty good, don't they?
we have that sheet in the back, by the way. If you guys need this sheet, it's available to pick it up and put it on your fridge.
So look at alfalfa hay, 22%, right? What do we see is we look at our weeds and look at the value of some of those weeds, almost matching it. So if we change the way we look at things and we change our paradigm, the opportunities out there are immense. It was when I saw this, and we've been working some things before, and I came across this information. To me, this was my aha moment, and to start changing people's perception, having this visual to show people why we need to look at things differently. This was a clear data point to bring up. I think, Alex, you want to talk about the little project we're doing? But
sure. Okay, so I'll bring it over. Right now, we are working with both Chris and Greg. They were out here this week. We posted on social media and got to the avenues that we could. They were meeting across Republic, Colville, Chewelah, Ione, Cusick, Newport, all over the place. And they were Northport too. Can't forget about Northport. Nope. And fortunately, they were able to come up here and do this presentation today, which I'm really grateful that they were able to take the time to do that, to speak with you all.
Green grass is up there, public stuff.
I'm sorry, what? How much green grass? Well, you know, I mean, nothing right
I'm
now.
gonna know there's probably,
Yeah.
but it's about, about 2 feet still.
Yes.
but we got, yeah. Anyway.
Yeah, so we do have, basically, we're putting cohorts together of folks who can help write generative agriculture grazing management plans. And that's what these guys will do. It's what I come out and write farm plans. That's what my background is. That's what I've done for the past 4 years. But I've been thrown many projects at this time, so I had to call in the big guns to help. And I'm grateful to them. So Chris will be coming out once a month for a week, the first week of every month through June. These projects go through June 30th because that's when our funding cycle ends, which makes 0 sense and does not align with any of the natural resource management stuff that I do, but that's another gripe for another day. And then Greg will be available to meet in person on a weekly basis. So he'll have days where he can come out and talk to you on your farm, get pictures, come up with ideas. And we're coming up with these plans based on regions. So we've got folks out of, like we said, Newport and Cusick, maybe some out of Ione. In the Stevens County area, you know, the 3 big hubs, Chewelah, Colville, Northport, and then Republic, there are some folks there as well. But I'm here and available to answer questions. Once we're done with our presentation, we'll stand back there and maybe answer some of those. You want to put down your information and we can get in contact with you. We also have an application. So if you are interested in having one of these regenerative ag grazing management plans done, we have those applications in the back and I can give those to you. So if you send them, you bring them into my office, you email them to us, we'll get you on a list and get you in one of the cohorts based on where you're located, what your interests are, what your needs are. And we are really happy to work with you. So if you have any questions, you can contact me or my office. There's my email address and the phone number, and myself or my resource technician, Corey, will call you back. So thank you guys so much. Yeah. Oh, I turned it off. There you go.
Okay, before everybody runs off here, Patrick wanted to have one more little announcement.
So I made a mistake. I looked over our laws. So if you make an application as a homeowner to more than 1 acre of agriculture land, you will need to make an application record and record so. Now, a private applicator license is not required. But if you want to apply